With the recent passage of the sweeping One Big Beautiful Bill, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is now on track to become the largest federal law enforcement agency in the United States, surpassing even the FBI in both funding and personnel. Supporters say it's a bold step towards securing the border. Critics warn it could drastically reshape the way immigration is enforced across the country. To help us break down what this means for immigration policy and the U.S. Mexico relations, we're joined by Tony Payan, the Claudio X. Gonzalez Fellow in U.S. Mexico Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Tony, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Ernie. A pleasure to be with you guys.
And if you have any questions for Tony Payan, you can give us a call at 713-440-8870. Now, Tony, anti-immigration hardliners, they see this as a major victory. But is there any way that this potentially could backfire, even on supporters and have this potential to become a kind of domestic army right here in the U.S.?
That's a very good question. I think, in the past, ever since I was a graduate student, I certainly took a look at law enforcement. My dissertation was on cops, soldiers, and diplomats, which was essentially looking at law enforcement in the war on drugs. So going back to the 1990s, I've been very aware of the way that there's always a mission creep. Agencies sort of change their mission bit by bit as they solve a problem. They certainly look for other missions. And I think there's a lot of danger in a very rapid growth by ICE. Some of the specific dangers of explosive growth, and we've seen it in the Border Patrol at the border after September 11th, I think, when the Border Patrol went from about 9,000 agents to about 19,000. They grew very quickly. And it's not just about the numbers. We have to remember that after a while, they're beginning to sort of, scraping the bottom of the barrel, hiring people with rather questionable judgment and moral character, low training, of course, in law and the use of weapons and rights, due process rights and such. And there is certainly an opportunity for a lack of accountability, racial profiling, especially if ICE begins to recruit with all these salaries they're offering, $100,000, $120,000 salaries to begin. If they begin to recruit some of the MAGA ideological folks that get in there and that don't really care that much. They don't have the right training to be law enforcement. They don't care about relationships with the community, and they begin to take shortcuts. If you think about the Hispanic and the immigrant population, we got about 65 million Hispanics in the country, and we got about 10.7 million undocumented. If you start taking a shortcut, i.e. racial profiling to sort of identify who's an immigrant and who's not, who's a U.S. citizen and who's not, then there's a lot of room for error. And we've seen the horror stories of abuse. So I would be very, very cautious with an explosive growth of ICE. There is a lot of room for mistakes, error, mistreatment of people who really are U.S. citizens. And so,
Sir,
I think there's danger here.
Did I read correctly that some ICE officers are being given the role of judge and jury right when they make an arrest?
Absolutely. We see story after story of U.S. citizens that they're definitely profiling. It's a tough time, I think, to be brown and be walking in the streets because, you may not be dressed well, and then they're driving around, they're going to specific places. We've seen stories of construction sites where they just simply go in there. There's 120 workers in there, and then they arrest them all, and then they try to figure out who's a citizen or not. We've seen that some of them have actually presented their documents, their legal residents, permanent residents, or there's U.S. citizens, U.S.-born individuals, and yet they're all taken away. We'll arrest you, we'll detain you now, we'll figure out who you are later. We've seen that the president has toyed with a potential deportation of citizens. So this is getting out of hand, and I think the polls are beginning to show that many Americans are beginning to think that this is really abusive and that the Trump administration is overreaching, and I think ICE will pay a price for that. We have to be very careful with the way we do law enforcement. We're just terrorizing our communities, and if we add many more agents without the proper vetting, the right screening, I think we're going to see a lot more of these mistakes.
You know, we talk about the speed and the quality of people that they're recruiting and the training and all of that. I am curious, though, on the other side of it all, was this growth necessary, regardless of how they're picking them now? They could maybe be doing it better. But is it something we needed to increase and increase at this level?
Well, evidently that's debatable. There are folks who think so. I don't believe so. If I look, I mean, I've also studied immigration for many, many years, 2.5 decades, and I can tell you that the number of undocumented people in the country essentially stabilized in around, I think, 2007, and it actually decreased after the 2008 2009 financial crisis. The numbers actually went down from 12.5 million to about 10.7 million. It may be a little bit more today because maybe some folks were allowed in the United States with a notice to appear, an NTA, in the last few years, and then they didn't show up in court. So the numbers may be up a little bit. But even then, even if you concede that there's 12, 13 million people, I don't think it's warranted. I think that issue was very much under control. We had a border crisis. We had an asylum crisis at the border, but I don't think we had a crisis of undocumented residents in the United States, and they certainly were not a public security and safety threat. We know that the literature shows over and over that most migrants, even undocumented migrants, are very law-abiding. This is an administrative violation of the law. It's not a criminal violation to be in the United States without papers. So none of this was really necessary. This is about politics. This is about the political theory. This is about a promise that president made to his political base, and he's trying to fulfill that. And we know who's driving this. One particular individual, Stephen Miller from California, who has expressed misgivings about Hispanic presence all the way back to high school. We know what his biography is, and obviously this is the individual that's today fully in charge of the immigration policy in the Trump administration.
All of these folks, do you know where they're being deployed? Is this just border, or are we talking about infiltrating the entire country across as Celeste alluded to, a military force within our country?
Well, they operate at about 400 points in the country. What I'm concerned about is the fact that if you give these guys $45 billion to build a detention system, which is what the big, beautiful bill does, and then you give them $30 billion additional dollars to hire people on a very fast pace with all the dangers that we just spoke about, then we're going to have all these guys that are going to be running around the country trying to make judgments in the streets, like you said, sort of saying, oh, that looks like a Hispanic guy, he looks undocumented to me, and then they detain him, sometimes erroneously so. And we're doing is giving incentives to certain companies, and not just the agents, but also the companies, to sort of begin to build the prisons or detention centers, facilities like the one in Florida that we just saw. And remember, these companies, this law enforcement, immigration law enforcement industrial complex, they get paid by the day, by the bed, for every immigrant that is detained. So the incentive is not necessarily to solve the problem, to fill it, but to fill in the beds, to get more people in there, and to keep them as many nights as it is possible, because they get paid per night and they make quite a bit of money. So there's a lot of opportunity here for these companies to simply say, look, we have a problem with to keep these people. We cannot just simply put them in a plane and send them away. For every night they keep somebody detained, they get paid by the government. That's the wrong structure of incentives.
Do you have
create this huge complex?
Do you have an updated number on how many deportations have occurred in this country? I read 68,000, but I don't know if that's an up-to-date number.
Oh no, it's a lot. It's a lot more than that. Just in Texas, I think the number of detentions since the Trump administration took office is, I don't want to say, I think it's about 90,000 detentions just in Texas.
How many deported? Actually deported?
Yeah, I don't know exactly the percentage or the number, but I know that there's a lot of incentive to retain them for a few more nights because they get paid for that. They're being deported very quickly, to be sure. I think the number of beds that are going to be added is 160,000 to, I believe the number of beds was about 65,000. So there's 160 to 160 more thousand beds. That's the objective. Imagine having 200,000 people, when this is all said and done, detained, and then these companies are being paid by the bed. The number of detentions may actually go down. I mean, detentions up, retentions up, and of course deportations down.
Okay, so my real question is, of all these tens of thousands of people, how many of them are felons, rapists, murderers,
Criminals.
the bad people that Donald Trump said he was going to get rid of? What percentage of those numbers are the bad people?
Yeah, this is a very good question. We know that the numbers, the statistics clearly show that immigrants commit crimes at a very low rate, much lower than U.S. citizens or native-born Americans. So there are very few. And the president himself made the promise that he would go only after those hardened criminals, and they would not actually go after the workers in construction sites, in food processing plants, in farms, and places like that. I think that promise didn't last very long. Within a day or two, ICE essentially spread out and began to go into these work sites. I think the number of really hardened criminals, my estimation is that it's a very, very small percentage, well below 1%, the real hardened criminals that ought to be deported from this country.
So most of them,
now, I think it's indiscriminate detentions.
I don't mean to be loaded with this question, but most of them have committed maybe a DUI or a misdemeanor, or even just overstayed their visa. So most of them are not hardened felons.
Right.
Okay. They don't.
No, that's right. That's right. We're not talking about murderers. We're not talking about people like that. I mean, there may be a handful of them, but really it's a very small number. The policy is not making a distinction today. I think it did under the Biden administration. It did under the first Trump administration to some extent. It did under the Obama administration. They were targeting specific individuals that were already in the list of criminals, people who had committed crimes that were looking for them. Today, I think the policy is essentially criminalizing everyone and going after everyone.
You're listening to Hello Houston. We are speaking with Tony Payan at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can join the conversation at 713-440-8870.
And my point is, Tony, that the person that's in charge of all of this, the president, is a convicted felon.
Well, it's ironic, isn't it? I mean, obviously, he has been convicted. There's 42 or 46. I don't remember the number.
I think it was 38. 38 felons.
I was going to say at least 36 of them. But yeah, I mean, this is hypocrisy. You know, this is a big issue. The concern, leave that aside. I think the concern here is that the consequences of this indiscriminate blanket enforcement that is going on risks not only our rights as individuals, because obviously U.S. citizens are being targeted as well in the numbers. I think just statistically, if you think about 65 million Hispanics and then 12 million undocumented, the room for error is very, very large. But the fact that these guys, are having to take shortcuts and racially profile people. So there's some real dangers. And also remember, we're also deputizing under the 287G program many of the local law enforcement agencies. So there's a force multiplier here, and it's compromising relations between law enforcement agencies and of course the communities that they serve. So there's that issue, but also we're squeezing the labor market. We've seen the cases of farms that have protested because their labor is being taken away. We've seen construction companies under stress because they can't deliver their projects because they don't have the workers. People don't show up to work. We've seen restaurants close because the kitchen staff doesn't show up because they're afraid of the raids. So they're creating some shock waves in the economy as well. So it's all law enforcement. We're not doing anything to create an opportunity for people to come in and work temporarily or permanently. We're not taking care of that. It's all lopsided, is all about enforcement, and I think that's going to have eventually serious consequences for our economy.
Tony, let me pull you out a little bit into a larger view on all of this, because we often forget that there's a world around us and it's not just us. I'm curious about Mexico's response to the passage of this bill and their reaction and what this could mean for us moving forward with them.
Yeah, Mexico is in a very difficult position. Mexico has no choice. And obviously, the Mexican government has made quite a few mistakes. They have allowed organized crime to grow, they have allowed the rule of law to be compromised. But Mexico is heavily dependent on the United States. And we saw the president push very, very hard on Mexico, just bear down on the Mexican government to detain and deport immigrants very quickly. There were some months in which Mexico was actually deporting more people to their countries than the United States was doing. So Mexico at this point is the wall. Mexico is paying for the wall. Mexico, I mean, I travel to El Paso and Juarez, my hometown out on the border. I grew up on the border, and I can tell you that there's nothing going on there. The shelters that I visited in Juarez, I think I counted 25 shelters with 32 people in them. That's it. That crisis is over. So what we're doing here is really not justified. That solved, we'll look to solving the problems within the United States and not just by deportation only. There have to be solutions that work for that community, for our economy, and for everyone, I think. So Mexico is simply going to be doing exactly what the president is going to ask them to do. President Sheinbaum, I think, is doing it, and she has no choice, really.
Tony, now I have a question regarding, when we're looking at President Trump's second term, and we're talking about this aggressive stance on immigration, I would love for you to elaborate or talk to us a little bit about, we understand that under President Biden's administration, there were hundreds of thousands of people being deported as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about the differences that are happening now?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a fundamental difference that I think it's important. Of course, the numbers of asylum seekers that were kind of knocking at the U.S. doors at the border was extraordinary. I think it simply overwhelmed the material capacity of the United States to process all these asylum claims. If you remember, at some point, former President Biden stopped the asylum claims because he said that if there were more than 30,000 a day, it was just simply going to collapse the system. And so the president tried to navigate that problem in many, many different ways. But the messaging, I think, was the wrong message, essentially, that you could come in, knock on the door, you'd be given an NTA to appear before an immigration judge, and then you could enter the United States. But at least they try to sort of calibrate the issues, try to assess the value, the genuine claim of asylum seekers. Today, however, we're looking at unprecedented cruelty by the Trump administration. I mean, talking about alligators and talking about these, dehumanizing people and talking about them as criminals when they're really just workers, undocumented, but ultimately workers contributing. We did a study in 2020 at the Baker Institute, and we showed that even in Texas, the contributions to the tax base of just undocumented immigrants in Texas was $500 million to the Texas coffers. So they're net contributors, even if they're undocumented. There has to be a solution for that. The cruelty that we're exhibiting towards immigrants and the dehumanization, I think, is simply unacceptable.
We do have a text, if you'll address it. I've heard this a lot, so I'm just interested in your answer. Being here illegally is actually a criminal offense. So how do you address that? It may not be a felony, but if you're here illegally, you're already a criminal.
No, that is incorrect. That is not the law. It is an administrative violation. You're certainly in violation of U.S. immigration laws, but it's not criminal. It's not classified as criminal. Congress may change that in the future, but let's be very clear. The word criminal, the criminalization of immigration, is being used precisely so that we deny the rights, the due process rights of these individuals. Because in this country, when you are a criminal, you are understood to have no rights. So it is a rhetorical instrument. It is a tool to dehumanize. So let's be very, very clear about that. I think we have to check the law and make sure, because I think it's an administrative violation. Somebody who overstates visa.
And to one of your points, we're going to run people off, and nobody's going to want to come here when we say, okay, now you can come back. Why would they want to come back? I think we're going to have a huge hole in our economy.
Under these conditions, I think few people coming into the United States. We're seeing the numbers drop even by legal and legitimate travelers from Europe and Canada. Tourism is way down. I know people in Mexico who are essentially canceling travel. In Texas, we'll receive 8 million visitors from Mexico alone. We see them in the Galleria here in Houston, shopping like crazy. Those people are postponing their trips. They're saying, I'm not going to subject myself to harassment by CBP at the airport upon landing. I'm not going to risk being detained and things like that. So people are canceling. I mean, I think we're losing quite a bit as a consequence, I think, of the kind of policy that we are implementing.
Tony Payan is the Claudio X. Gonzalez Fellow in U.S. Mexico Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Tony, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure, guys. Till next time.